In the midst of New York's most extravagant charity gala, an anonymous waitress dared to do what no one else would, stepping out to block a high society lady's slap aimed at an elderly woman in a wheelchair. That elderly woman was the mother of the city's most feared crime boss. And that moment changed everything. She had nothing to lose, and she was the only one willing to risk everything. If you want to know the price of that courage, follow the story to the very end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. The chandelier above the Grand Meridian Ballroom cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Sofia Reyes knew this because she had overheard two drunk hedge fund managers arguing about it earlier, their voices too loud and their ties pulled loose, debating whether the crystals were Bohemian or Austrian, as if the answer mattered to anyone on earth. She didn't care. She cared about the weight of the serving tray cutting into her left palm, the dull ache in her lower back from 9 straight hours on her feet, and the $63 in tips folded into her apron pocket that would go toward her mother's medication refill tomorrow morning. The ballroom was packed. 600 guests, maybe more, politicians with camera-ready smiles, tech founders who dressed like teenagers but moved money like warlords, fashion editors, gallery owners, a retired Supreme Court justice, 2 network news anchors, and enough old-money Manhattan families to fill a cemetery's worth of mausoleums. The annual Hargrove Foundation Charity Gala raised millions every year for causes that looked beautiful on press releases and changed almost nothing on the streets where Sofia had grown up. She moved between tables with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. Tray up, smile neutral, eye contact brief. Don't linger. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist louder than the piano music drifting from the corner where a man in a tuxedo played Debussy for people who weren't listening. Her supervisor, a wiry man named Gerald with a permanent scowl and a clipboard he wielded like a weapon, had pulled her aside before the doors opened. Table 14 is a VIP cluster. Valkov family and their people. You keep their glasses full and your mouth shut. Anything goes sideways, you come find me. You don't handle it. You don't react. You smile and you walk away. Understood? Sofia had nodded. She always nodded. Table 14 sat near the east windows overlooking Central Park, positioned with the kind of deliberate geography that announced importance without needing a sign. 8 chairs, only 5 occupied. 2 men in dark suits who never touched their food and never stopped scanning the room. A younger man, mid-30s, sharp jawline, dark hair combed back with a stillness about him that felt more dangerous than any of the loud voices at neighboring tables. Beside him, an older woman in a wheelchair, her silver hair pulled into an elegant braid, her hands folded on a cashmere blanket draped across her lap. The woman's eyes were bright and restless, taking in the room with a hunger that suggested she hadn't been out in a long time. Sofia refilled water glasses. She cleared a bread plate. She noticed the older woman watching the dancers on the floor with something close to grief, and she almost said something, almost asked if she wanted anything, but Gerald's voice echoed in her skull, and she kept moving. It happened at 10 minutes past 9. Sofia was returning from the kitchen with a fresh tray of champagne flutes when the voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade dragged across glass. High-pitched, theatrical, soaked in the particular cruelty that only came from someone who had never once faced consequences. "Oh my God, is that Elena Valkov? They actually wheeled you out tonight?" The speaker was Margot Ashford. Sofia didn't know her by name then, but she would learn it later. Everyone in that world knew Margot, the widow of a pharmaceutical magnate, a woman whose social influence was built on a foundation of inherited money and weaponized gossip. She stood over Elena's wheelchair with a champagne glass tilted at a careless angle, her smile wide and sharp and utterly empty of warmth. Elena said nothing. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers gripped the armrest of her wheelchair. "I heard you've been locked up in that house for what, 3 years now? 4?" Margot laughed. The sound carried, heads turned, conversations dimmed. "Damien keeps you hidden away like some embarrassing family secret. Can't say I blame him. You look absolutely dreadful, sweetheart." The younger man at the table, Damien, started to rise. One of the suited men placed a hand on his forearm, a gesture so small and so practiced it was clearly a protocol they had rehearsed. "Don't react. Not here. Not in front of cameras and witnesses and 600 pairs of eyes. that would sell the story to page 6 before dessert was served. Damien sat back down. His face was stone, but his right hand, resting on the table, had closed into a fist so tight the knuckles had gone white. Margot wasn't finished. She never was, because people like her fed on silence the way fire fed on oxygen. She leaned closer to Elena, her voice dropping to a stage whisper loud enough for the nearest 4 tables to hear. You know, everyone said you used to be something, a real force. Now look at you, sitting in that chair like a sad little... That's enough. The words left Sophia's mouth before her brain had authorized them. She heard them as if someone else had spoken, as if the voice belonged to a stranger standing behind her. But the tray was still in her hands and the room was turning toward her, and the champagne flutes were trembling with the vibration of her own heartbeat. Margot blinked. The interruption didn't compute. Waitstaff did not speak at these events. They circulated. They served. They vanished. They were furniture with pulses. Excuse me? Margot's head swiveled. Her eyes found Sophia, the black uniform, the apron, the sensible shoes, the tray, and her expression cycled through confusion, amusement, and contempt in roughly 2 seconds. Did you just speak to me? Sophia's legs felt like they were filled with wet sand. Every survival instinct she had was screaming at her to apologize, to lower her eyes, to back away and disappear into the kitchen and pretend this moment never happened. She had her mother's prescriptions to think about, her brother's school fees, the rent that was already 12 days late. She could not afford to lose this job. She could not afford to lose anything, because she had nothing left to lose that wouldn't break something essential. But she had watched Elena's face when Margot spoke. She had seen it. The way the older woman's chin dropped a fraction of an inch. The way her shoulders pulled inward. The way her eyes went somewhere else entirely, somewhere deep and dark and practiced, as if she had learned long ago how to leave her own body when the cruelty became too much. Sophia knew that look. She had worn it herself. I said that's enough. Her voice was steadier the second time. Not brave, not heroic, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 9-hour shift. She hasn't done anything to you. Margot straightened. The champagne glass in her hand tilted farther, and a thin stream of liquid splashed onto Elena's blanket. Whether it was deliberate or accidental didn't matter. The damage was theatrical either way. Do you have any idea who I am? Margot's voice climbed. This was performance now. She was aware of the audience, aware of the phones angling upward from nearby tables, aware that the story of her dominance would circulate and reinforce the architecture of fear that kept her world intact. Do you have any idea what I can do to you? 1 phone call. 1. And you'll never work in this city again. Maybe, Sophia said, but you're still not going to touch her. Because she had seen it. In the half-second before Sophia spoke the first time, she had seen Margot's right hand rise, fingers extended, the motion already committed. Not a gesture, not a wave, but the beginning of a strike aimed at the face of a woman who could not stand up to defend herself. The ballroom was silent, not quiet. Silent. The pianist had stopped. The servers had frozen. 600 people in clothes worth more than Sophia's entire apartment building held their breath and did absolutely nothing. Margot's face went red, then white. Her hand, still raised, trembled in the air between them like a question no one wanted to answer. You're fired, Margot hissed. You're done. She doesn't work for you. The voice came from the table, low, even, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume. Damien Valkov hadn't moved from his chair. He hadn't raised his voice. He simply spoke, and the air pressure in the room seemed to change. Walk away, Margot. Now. Margot opened her mouth, closed it, looked around the room for allies and found none, because the people in that room understood power the way animals understood weather, and the storm system sitting at table 14 was not something anyone wanted to challenge tonight. She left, heels clicking against marble, champagne glass abandoned on a stranger's table, her exit a controlled performance of dignity that convinced no one. Sophia stood in the aftermath with her tray still balanced on her palm and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She became aware slowly of the stairs, of the whispers starting up like cicadas after a thunderclap, of Gerald's face across the room, white with fury, already moving toward her. What's your name? She looked down. Elena Valkov was looking up at her. The older woman's eyes were wet, but her chin was up now, and there was something fierce in her expression that hadn't been there before. Sophia Reyes. Elena reached out and took Sophia's free hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Thank you, Sophia. Gerald arrived like a small tornado of anxious authority. He took Sophia by the elbow and steered her away from the table, through the kitchen doors and into the fluorescent-lit service corridor where the illusion of elegance ended and the reality of labor began. What the hell was that? He wasn't yelling. His voice was too controlled for yelling. This was the voice of a man calculating liability. Do you understand what you just did? Do you have any concept of... She was going to hit her. I don't care if she was going to set her on fire. You don't engage. You don't speak. You certainly don't talk back to Margot Ashford at a 7-figure fundraiser in front of half the social register of Manhattan. Gerald's clipboard was shaking. You're done. Collect your things. I'll have your final check mailed. Sophia untied her apron. She folded it neatly. She set it on the stainless steel prep counter beside a row of dessert plates arranged like soldiers waiting for deployment. She didn't argue because arguing required energy she no longer had, and because Gerald was right. She had broken every rule of invisible service, and the world she had just stepped out of was not a world that rewarded disobedience from people who wore aprons. She changed in the cramped employee locker room, trading her uniform for jeans and a gray jacket that had belonged to her father before he disappeared 8 years ago. The jacket was too big in the shoulders and frayed at the cuffs, but it smelled like nothing now, which was its own kind of loss. Outside, the October air hit her face like a slap from a cleaner hand than Margot Ashford's. She walked 3 blocks before her legs started trembling, and then she sat on the steps of a brownstone that probably cost $15 million and pressed her forehead against her knees and breathed. $63. Minus the cab fare she would need because the subway didn't feel safe this late. Minus the medication copay. Minus the water bill she had been putting off. The math wasn't math anymore. It was just subtraction from a number that had already reached 0. Her phone buzzed. A text from her brother, Marco. Mom's asking if you ate tonight. I told her yes. Did you? Sophia typed back, yes. She hadn't. She'd eaten half a bread roll from a return plate in the kitchen at 6 o'clock and nothing since. She started walking. The Reyes apartment was in Washington Heights, a 5th-floor walk-up in a building where the elevator had been broken since before Sophia was born, and the superintendent responded to maintenance requests with the same enthusiasm a corpse would show toward a dinner invitation. The stairwell smelled like bleach and old cooking oil. The hallway light on the 3rd floor had been out for 6 weeks. Her mother, Carmen, was asleep in the recliner when Sophia came in. The television was on. Some late-night infomercial selling a kitchen gadget with the breathless urgency of a man describing the end of the world. Carmen's breathing was shallow, the oxygen cannula resting in her nostrils, the concentrator humming its mechanical lullaby from the corner. Pulmonary fibrosis. The diagnosis had come 2 years ago, and the disease had moved through Carmen's lungs with the patient cruelty of something that intended to stay. Marco was at the kitchen table, textbooks spread around him like a barricade. 17 years old, junior year, already taking AP classes that Sophia couldn't afford the exam fees for. He looked up when she came in and read her face the way he always did, quickly, accurately, and with the kind of premature emotional intelligence that only developed in children who had been forced to grow up inside a crisis. Bad night? I got fired. Marco's pen stopped moving. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, the gala thing? Yeah. What happened? Sophia opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of eggs, a container of leftover rice, a bottle of hot sauce. She closed it. A woman was going to hit someone. I stopped her. That's it? That's it. Marco nodded slowly. He understood the economy of their situation too well to waste time on moral outrage. Good and right were luxuries. Rent was a deadline. We'll figure it out, he said, which was what he always said, and which had stopped being reassuring approximately 14 months ago. Sophia checked on her mother, adjusted the blanket, turned off the infomercial, and let the silence settle. She stood in the dark living room with her father's jacket still on and her hands in her pockets. and thought about the look on Elena Valkov's face. Not the gratitude, not the tears. The thing underneath, the shock of being seen, of someone acknowledging that she existed, that her pain was real, that she deserved to be defended simply because she was a person and not a prop in someone else's performance. Sophia had given that to a stranger. She wondered what it would cost her. The answer came 3 days later. She was coming out of a temp agency on Lexington Avenue, the fourth one that week, each offering the same apologetic smile and the same explanation that her termination from the Hargrove event had already made rounds. When she noticed the black sedan parked across the street, it was the kind of car that cost more than her annual income. Tinted windows, engine running. A man in a dark suit stood beside the rear door with his hands clasped in front of him, and he was looking directly at her. Sophia kept walking. In her neighborhood, you learned early that eye contact with the wrong person was an invitation to trouble. But the man moved to intercept her, stepping onto the sidewalk with a practiced ease that suggested he had done this many times before. "Miss Reyes, Mr. Valkov would like to speak with you." Sophia's feet stopped before her brain gave permission. "I'm sorry." "Damien Valkov. He's in the car. He'd like a moment of your time." Every instinct told her to decline. Every movie she had ever watched, every cautionary story her mother had ever told, every headline about women who got into cars with strangers, all of it screamed no. But there was something else, too. Curiosity. And beneath that, the irrational pull of a situation that couldn't possibly make her life worse than it already was. She got in the car. The interior smelled like leather and something subtle, expensive, woodsy. Damien Valkov sat on the opposite side of the back seat, separated from her by an expanse of cream-colored upholstery that felt like a demilitarized zone. He was dressed differently than at the gala. Dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, no tie. Without the formal armor, he looked younger. But his eyes were the same. Dark, steady, assessing. Eyes that measured the weight of everything they looked at. "Miss Reyes, thank you for getting in." "I'm not sure I had a choice." It came out sharper than she intended. Fear did that, turned her honesty into blades. The faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "You had a choice. You always have a choice. That's actually why I'm here." He reached into the seat pocket and produced a thin folder. He didn't open it. He held it between them like an offering or an accusation. "I know about your situation, your mother's condition, the medical debt, your brother's school, the termination from the catering company. I know the temp agencies have been turning you away because Margot Ashford made some calls." He paused. "I also know you have approximately $1,100 in your checking account and that your rent is due in 4 days." Sophia's stomach dropped. Not because he was wrong, he wasn't, but because hearing the architecture of her desperation described so precisely by a stranger felt like being stripped naked in a public square. "Did you pull my financial records?" "I pulled everything. It's what I do." He said it without apology or pride. A statement of fact, like telling someone the sky was blue. "I needed to understand who you were before I made this offer." "What offer?" Damien set the folder on the seat between them. "My mother needs a caregiver, full-time, someone who will live at the estate, manage her daily physical therapy, coordinate with her medical team, and provide companionship. The position pays $8,000 a month, plus housing, plus full medical coverage for your immediate family. Your brother would have access to private tutoring, and I would personally guarantee his college tuition when the time comes." The numbers didn't register at first. They were too large, too incongruent with the arithmetic she had been performing in her head for the past 3 days, which had mainly involved calculating how many meals she could skip before her body stopped cooperating. "Why me?" "Because 3 nights ago you stood in a room full of the most powerful people in New York City, and you were the only one who moved." He leaned forward slightly. 600 people watched Margot Ashford humiliate my mother. Senators, CEOs, people who could have ended Margot's social career with a single word. None of them did. You did. A woman making $11 an hour with nothing to gain and everything to lose. That tells me more about your character than any background check ever could. Sophia studied him. She was looking for the catch, the angle, the hidden clause written in ink she couldn't see. Men who offered drowning people lifelines usually expected something in return. She had learned that lesson young. I'm not a nurse. I'm not a physical therapist. I waited tables. I have nurses. I have therapists. What my mother needs is someone who sees her as a person and not a patient, someone who won't treat her like she's fragile. His voice shifted. Something underneath the control cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to see that this man who radiated authority like heat from asphalt was carrying something heavy. She hasn't left that house in 3 years. She barely speaks. She's given up, Miss Reyes, and the only time I've seen her fight in years was when she looked at you. The car was silent except for the muffled sounds of Lexington Avenue traffic, a bus horn, a cyclist shouting. The ordinary music of a city that didn't care about the conversation happening inside a black sedan with tinted windows. I need to think about it. You have 24 hours. He handed her a card. Heavy stock, embossed, nothing but a phone number. Call that number. Ask for Christoph. He'll arrange everything. Sophia took the card. She opened the door. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and the cold air rushed in like reality reasserting itself. Miss Reyes. She turned back. Damien Valkov's face was half in shadow, half lit by the streetlight filtering through the tinted glass. What you did at that gala was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen. I'm still deciding which. Maybe both, she said. She closed the door. The sedan pulled away, silent as a shark. Sophia stood on Lexington Avenue with a card in her hand and the full weight of what had just happened settling onto her shoulders like a coat made of iron. She knew what the smart answer was. She knew what the safe answer was. She also knew that her mother's oxygen concentrator was rented, not owned, and that the rental company had called twice this week about the overdue payment. She went home. She sat at the kitchen table after Marco had gone to bed, and Carmen was asleep in the recliner, and the apartment was quiet except for the concentrator's hum and the distant sound of sirens. She turned the card over in her fingers. She thought about Elena Valkov's grip on her hand. She thought about Damien Valkov's eyes in the half-dark. She called the number at 7 the next morning. The car arrived at noon. A different car this time. An SUV with a driver who introduced himself as Christoph, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and an accent she couldn't place, and a manner that suggested he had seen everything the world had to offer and had decided most of it wasn't worth commenting on. They drove north out of the city, through the Bronx, past Yonkers, into Westchester County, where the buildings gave way to trees and the air changed and the road narrowed and curved through neighborhoods where the houses sat so far back from the street they were barely visible behind walls of stone and iron and perfectly maintained hedges. The Valkov estate was not a house, it was a compound, a main residence built from gray stone that looked like it had been transported from somewhere older and colder and more severe, surrounded by manicured grounds that stretched to a tree line in every direction. Security cameras on the gateposts, a guard at the entrance who checked Christoph's credentials even though he clearly recognized him, a second gate, a long driveway, and then the house itself, rising up like a fortress that had learned to disguise itself as a home. Sophia was shown to a room on the second floor. It was bigger than her entire apartment, a 4-poster bed, a private bathroom with a bathtub she could have swum in, a window overlooking a garden where someone had planted roses that were still holding their color despite the October chill. Her suitcase, one suitcase, everything she owned that wasn't furniture, looked absurd in the corner of that room. A small, battered rectangle of poverty in a landscape of obscene wealth. She unpacked. She sat on the bed. She pressed her hands flat against the comforter and felt the thread count through her fingertips and thought, this is not my life. Elena was waiting for her in the sunroom. The older woman sat in her wheelchair beside a wall of windows, bathed in the pale gold of autumn afternoon light. She looked different than she had at the gala. Smaller, more fragile. The fierce expression Sophia remembered had been replaced by something guarded, as if the brief spark of that night had already been swallowed by whatever darkness she lived inside. A nurse hovered nearby, adjusting an IV line. 2 guards stood at the far end of the room, silent and massive. The medical equipment surrounding Elena, the monitors, the medication tray, the specialized wheelchair with its custom supports, told a story of a body that had been through something catastrophic, and had only partially recovered. Mrs. Valkov, I'm Sophia. I know who you are. Elena's voice was quiet but clear. You're the girl who ruined her career to protect an old woman she'd never met. I didn't ruin my career, I was a waitress. Waitresses get fired all the time. Elena studied her for a long moment. Sit down, Sophia. Sophia sat. The chair was leather and absurdly comfortable, and she hated it immediately because comfort in this house felt like a trap being set in slow motion. My son told you about the position? He did. Did he tell you why I'm in this chair? He said you needed a caregiver. Elena's mouth tightened. That's not what I asked. Sophia hesitated. No, he didn't tell me why. Elena turned her head toward the window. The light caught the lines of her face, the angles of a beauty that time and pain had sharpened rather than erased. Everyone in this house lies to me, Sophia. They lie about my condition. They lie about the danger. They lie about what happened to put me here. They smile and they adjust my pillows, and they tell me everything will be fine. She turned back. If you're going to be here, I need you to understand something. I am not interested in fine. I am interested in the truth. Can you give me that? I don't know enough to lie to you, Mrs. Valkov. Good. That's a start. Elena reached for a glass of water on the side table. Her hand shook. Sophia watched her struggle with it for 3 seconds, then moved to help. Elena's eyes snapped to her. Don't! I can do this. Sophia pulled her hand back. She watched Elena lift the glass, watched the tremor travel from her hand through her wrist to her forearm, watched her bring it to her lips and drink and set it back down with a sound that was too loud in the quiet room. You see, Elena said, that took me 4 months to learn, 4 months to lift a glass of water. My son hired the best therapists in the country, and it took me 4 months. She paused. I used to dance, Sophia. I was a dancer before I was anything else, and now I celebrate lifting a glass. The bitterness in her voice was deep and old and well-earned. Sophia didn't try to soften it. She didn't offer encouragement or optimism or any of the bright, hollow phrases that people threw at suffering like coins into a fountain, hoping to purchase comfort they weren't willing to actually provide. What do you want me to do, Mrs. Valkov? Elena looked at her, really looked at her. Sophia felt the weight of that gaze, an old woman's assessment, far more penetrating than any background check Damien could have commissioned. Help me remember that I'm alive. The first week was brutal. Elena did not want companionship. She did not want conversation. She did not want the cheerful presence of a stranger disrupting the architecture of isolation she had spent 3 years constructing. She wanted to be left alone in her sunroom with her windows and her silence and her bitterness, and she communicated this through a combination of clipped responses, deliberate rudeness, and an icy withdrawal that would have broken a lesser person. Sophia did not break. She had survived worse. She had sat in hospital waiting rooms while doctors explained her mother's prognosis with the detached sympathy of people who delivered bad news the way postal workers delivered mail. She had held Marco during the nights when he cried about their father's absence and pretended the next morning that nothing had happened. She had stood in line at government offices for hours to argue over benefits and been treated with a bureaucratic contempt that made Margot Ashford's cruelty look amateurish. She could handle a difficult old woman in a wheelchair. She could handle anything. By the 3rd day, she stopped asking Elena what she wanted and started observing. She noticed that Elena's eyes tracked movement constantly. Birds outside the window, staff crossing the grounds, the shadows of tree branches shifting on the floor. A dancer's eyes. Eyes that missed nothing about the physical world even as her body refused to participate in it. On the 4th day, Sophia brought a portable speaker into the sunroom and played music. Not the gentle, therapeutic selections the nurses had tried. Not classical. Not the careful, soothing playlist that treated Elena like a patient to be managed. She played what she herself liked. Motown, Old Soul, Aretha Franklin and Marvin Gaye, and Sam Cooke. Music that had muscle in it. Music that demanded something from the listener. Elena didn't react, didn't acknowledge it, but she didn't tell Sophia to turn it off either. On the 5th day, Sophia caught Elena's fingers moving against the armrest of her wheelchair. Subtle, barely visible, but rhythmic, tapping in time. That night, Sophia sat in her enormous room and cried without understanding exactly why. Exhaustion, maybe, or relief, or the strange, disorienting grief of witnessing someone else's loss while carrying so much of her own. She called Marco before bed. He told her Carmen's breathing had been good today. He told her the new medication delivery had arrived. He told her the landlord had stopped calling about the rent. He didn't say thank you because they had passed the point where gratitude was necessary between them. They were survivors, and survivors didn't thank each other for holding the line. They just held it. The second week, Sophia pushed. She started bringing Elena outside. Not far, just to the garden, to the stone path that wound between the rose beds. Elena resisted. The wheelchair felt like a prison she was being paraded through, and every guard they passed, every camera that tracked their movement, was a reminder that this beautiful compound was also a cage. But the air was different outside. The light was different. And Sophia saw Elena lift her face to the October sun and close her eyes and breathe in a way she never breathed indoors. Deep, greedy, alive. "Tomorrow, we go farther," Sophia said. Elena opened one eye. "You're very pushy for an employee. You're very stubborn for someone who says she wants to be alive." Elena stared at her. Then, and this was the first time Sophia had seen it, the corner of her mouth lifted. Not a smile. Not yet, but the ghost of one. The memory of the muscle movement, buried under 3 years of pain, surfacing for just a moment before sinking back. It was the smallest victory Sophia had ever celebrated. It was also the most important. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the same afternoon, outside the estate's perimeter wall, a dark van sat parked beneath the trees on the county road. Inside, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes raised a telephoto lens and captured 17 photographs of the garden, the guards, the wheelchair, and the woman pushing it. The photographs were uploaded to an encrypted server within the hour. They were reviewed by a man sitting in a penthouse overlooking the East River, a man whose name Sophia had never heard, and whose existence would soon rewrite every equation of her life. Victor Moreau studied the images on his screen, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression the calm of a predator who had learned patience not out of virtue, but out of the understanding that the most devastating strikes required the most careful preparation. He tapped one photograph, Sophia, caught mid-stride, pushing Elena's wheelchair along the garden path. He enlarged it, studied her face, her posture, the way she leaned forward, her attention entirely focused on the woman in front of her. "Who is she?" he asked. "Nobody," said the man standing behind him. "A waitress. New hire." Victor smiled. It was the kind of smile that preceded funerals. "Nobody," he repeated. "Perfect. Nobodies are the easiest to destroy, and the best way to hurt a man like Damien Valkov is not to come for him directly." He tapped the photograph again. "You come for the people he's just begun to care about." He closed the laptop. In the garden, Sophia pushed Elena's wheelchair toward the rose beds and talked about the weather and didn't know that the world had just shifted beneath her feet, silently, irrevocably, like a fault line preparing to rupture. And 200 miles away, in a basement apartment in Washington Heights, Marco Reyes walked home from school, earbuds in, backpack slung over one shoulder, unaware that a man in a gray coat had been following him for 3 blocks, matching his pace exactly, watching, waiting, and memorizing every detail of his route. Marco Reyes didn't notice the man in the gray coat until the second day. The first day, he had been too absorbed in the argument looping through his earbuds, a podcast debate about whether a certain economic theory had caused more damage than the crisis it was supposed to prevent, to notice anything as mundane as a stranger keeping pace on the opposite sidewalk. He was 17. He was tired. He had spent the previous evening managing his mother's medication schedule alone for the first time since Sophia had moved to the estate, and somewhere between crushing Carmen's pills into her evening applesauce and writing a lab report due the next morning, he had crossed the boundary from tired into a specific kind of exhaustion that lived in the back of the skull and pressed outward. The second day, he noticed. Gray coat, middle distance, always slightly behind. The face was ordinary in a way that felt deliberate. The kind of face assembled to be forgotten. When Marco stopped at the bodega on 181st for a bottle of water, The man stopped outside a dry cleaner 2 doors down and looked at his phone. When Marco started walking again, the man started walking again. Marco bought the water. He paid. He walked out. He turned not left toward home, but right toward the park, a direction that served no practical purpose and would add 8 minutes to his commute. The man in the gray coat turned right. Marco walked for half a block, then stopped and turned around directly. The man had already adjusted, was already looking at something across the street, already performing the elaborate pantomime of being somewhere else. Marco was 17, not stupid. He pulled out his phone and called Sophia. She answered on the second ring. He could hear wind, outdoor air, the distant sound of another voice. "Someone's following me," he said. No preamble. Sophia had taught him that when something was wrong, you said what was wrong. Cushioning it didn't change it. The wind noise stopped. She had moved somewhere and closed. "Where are you?" "Just past the park entrance on 181st. Gray coat, medium height. He's been on me since I left school." "Don't run. Don't confront him. Go to the bodega, stay inside, buy something, and text me every 2 minutes until I call you back." She hung up before he could answer. He went back to the bodega. He bought a granola bar he didn't want. He stood near the window and watched the gray coat maintain his distance on the opposite sidewalk, not moving closer, not retreating, holding the line with the patience of someone operating on a very specific set of instructions. 7 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the bodega. Not the same car that had brought Sophia to the estate, but the same category, the same tinted authority, the same air of institutional muscle. The door opened and Christoph got out. He walked to Marco with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had handled situations like this before and had never once needed to hurry. "Your sister sent me. Come on." Marco looked at the gray coat across the street. "What about him?" "He's being dealt with." Marco didn't ask what that meant. He got in the car. Sophia was waiting in the main sitting room of the estate when they arrived, standing rather than sitting, her arms crossed, and her jaw set in the expression Marco had catalogued as her crisis face, controlled on the surface, burning underneath. She held him for 3 seconds exactly, which was how Sophia hugged. Not long enough to acknowledge that she'd been scared, just long enough to verify he was intact. "You're staying here," she said. "I have school." "You have an online option through your school's portal. I checked. You can do it here." "Sophia." "Marco." Her voice went quiet, which was worse than loud. "Someone followed you home. That's not something we argue about." He argued about it anyway for 11 minutes, citing academic standards and AP exam preparation and the social consequences of disappearing mid-semester. Sophia listened without interrupting, which was her technique for waiting out storms she had already decided to outlast. When he finished, she looked at him. "You're staying here," she said again. He stayed. Damien was informed the same evening. Sophia found him in his office, a room that served as the central nervous system of an operation she still only understood in outline. He was on the phone when she knocked, and he held up one finger without looking at her, the universal gesture of men who arranged their lives around uninterruptible business. And she waited in the doorway, with her arms still crossed and her patience wearing thin, which was not a condition she typically permitted herself. He finished the call. He looked at her. He read her expression the same way Marco did, with the same rapid precision, though his reading produced a different response. Not softness, but attention. Full, complete attention, the kind that made you feel like the only solid object in the room. "You already know," she said, "about Marco." "Christoph briefed me." "Then you know this is connected to whatever you have going on with the Moreau Syndicate." Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise. "What do you know about the Moreau Syndicate?" "I know they're responsible for what happened to your mother." She had found this out from Elena herself 2 days ago, in the garden. Elena had told her with the flat precision of someone reciting a fact they had spent years learning not to flinch at. An ambush. A car. A road. A night 3 years ago when Elena had been traveling alone against Damien's advice, and the people who wanted to wound Damien most had decided the most efficient method was to wound the person he loved most instead. "I know someone is watching this property. I know my brother was followed, and I know you're sitting in this office making phone calls instead of telling me what kind of danger we're actually in." Damien set his pen down. The office was quiet except for the hum of the computers on his desk and the distant sound of the ground security doing their circuit outside. "Sit down, Sophia." "I'd rather stand." "I know." He leaned back in his chair. 3 weeks ago, Victor Moreau sent a message. He's been building pressure for 6 months, pulling supply lines, compromising business partners, creating financial friction in a dozen different industries where I have interests. The surveillance on this property started 10 days ago, which is 2 days before you came here. So this is already old. What happened with your brother today escalated the timeline." "What timeline?" He looked at her steadily. "Victor wants me to dismantle my operation, to step back from every network I control and hand the structure over to him. He believes he can absorb what I've built and consolidate it with his own to create something large enough that no one in the city could oppose him." "And you said no." "I haven't said anything yet. I've been stalling." He picked up the pen again, turned it in his fingers. A habit, she had noticed, a tell that indicated he was working through something he hadn't resolved. Victor is patient, but he's not infinitely patient. He started using personal leverage because he knows direct confrontation against this property is too costly, too visible. He wants me off balance first. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Outside, a security light swept across the window. "My brother and I are the personal leverage," she said. "Yes." "And your mother?" "Always." She uncrossed her arms. She looked at the window, at the sweep of the light, at her own reflection ghost thin in the glass. She had walked into this house carrying one suitcase and a debt load and a mother on oxygen and a brother who was too smart for the life he'd been given. She had walked in because Elena needed someone to push her wheelchair, and Damien had offered her a number that made breathing easier. She had not walked in to become a bargaining chip in someone else's war. "What happens if you give him what he wants?" Damien's expression didn't change. "People I'm responsible for get hurt. People who depend on the structures I maintain lose their protection. Victor runs things differently than I do. He doesn't manage. He extracts. And if you don't, he escalates." "How bad does escalate get?" Damien set the pen down again. "Bad enough that I want you and your brother and my mother somewhere he can't reach. Your mother will never agree to relocate. She spent 3 years trying to find stability inside these walls. You move her again, you lose whatever ground she's gained." His jaw tightened. She had said the right thing, which was also the hard thing, which was apparently her function in this household, to say the right hard thing to people who were surrounded by people paid to say the comfortable wrong thing. "I know," he said. "Then we stay," she said. "And you figure out a solution that doesn't involve turning us into refugees." She walked out before he could respond. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, the technique she used when panic wanted to arrive, and she needed to hold the door closed for another 10 minutes. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the wall behind her and felt the plaster, cool and solid, and kept breathing until the shaking stopped. Elena's physical therapist arrived the next morning, a brisk woman named Dr. Park, who spoke to Elena in the clipped, encouraging cadence of someone accustomed to patients who had given up. Sophia had been present for these sessions for 2 weeks now, had watched the exercises, had learned the language of the recovery, which muscles were responding, which joints needed heat before movement, which sequences triggered pain versus productive resistance. That morning, Dr. Park was setting up when Elena looked at Sophia from her wheelchair and said, "Leave us." Dr. Park's hand stilled on her equipment. Sophia looked at Elena. Elena looked back. There was something different in her face today, a tension that hadn't been there yesterday, something coiled and awake. "I can stay and observe," Sophia said. "I said leave." Sophia left. She stood in the hallway outside the therapy room with her arms crossed and her ear unofficially close to the door and heard nothing useful for 20 minutes. Only the sounds of physical effort and Dr. Park's instruction and Elena's breathing, which had become a sound Sophia could interpret the way other people read weather, the quality of it telling her things about Elena's interior state that no medical chart could capture. At the end of the session, when Dr. Park emerged with her equipment bag and her professionally neutral expression, she paused beside Sophia. "She's been pushing harder this week," she said quietly, More than I've prescribed. The muscle fatigue is significant. If she continues at this rate, she risks setback. She knows that? Dr. Park looked at her. Mrs. Valkov knows everything. That's never been her problem. Sophia went back in. Elena was still in her wheelchair, her hands in her lap, her face damp with exertion. She looked exhausted in a way that wasn't physical. She looked like someone who had made a decision. What are you doing? Sophia asked. Exercising. Dr. Park says you're pushing too hard. Dr. Park is paid to be cautious. I'm not interested in caution. Sophia pulled a chair close and sat, close enough that Elena would have to make an effort to avoid looking at her. Why now? What changed? Elena was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes went to the window, to the garden where the roses had finished their last October bloom and were settling into their bare winter architecture. I heard about the boy, Elena said. Your brother. Word travels fast. In this house, everything travels fast. The walls here have been listening for 30 years. She turned back. I know what it means when Victor Moreau starts following people. I know what it means that he chose your brother and not one of Damien's associates. Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that was on the other side of fear. It means he's identified who in this house actually matters to my son, and he intends to use them. That's what Damien said. Damien says many things. He doesn't say what I'm about to say. Elena leaned forward. I have spent 3 years in this wheelchair believing I was already dead, believing the useful part of my life was finished, believing that the only thing I had left to do was take up space and wait. Her eyes were very bright. I'm not willing to die in that particular way, Sophia, not for Victor Moreau's convenience. So push harder in therapy. That's the answer? The answer is that I will not be carried out of this house by someone else's hands. I will walk out of it on my own, or I will fight to stay in it on my own, but I will not be moved again like furniture. She held Sophia's gaze. I need you to help me, not the way Dr. Park helps me, the way you helped me at that gala. Sophia understood. It wasn't about the exercises. It was about the other thing, the thing underneath the exercises. The will that preceded the muscle, the decision to still be a person when everything in your situation argued that personhood was a luxury you could no longer afford. Okay, Sophia said, starting tonight. Starting tonight. What Sophia didn't tell Elena was that she had already called the number Gerald had given her 2 weeks before. The number she had thought was for employment references, but had turned out to be something else entirely. A man who knew things. A man who had reached out to her after the gala story made its small, quiet rounds, who had left a voicemail saying only that he had information about Damien Valkov that she might find useful, and that she should call if she ever wanted to understand what she had actually walked into. She had called him from the bathroom of her room at 11 o'clock the previous night. His name was Callahan. He said he was a federal investigator. He said he had been building a case against the Moreau syndicate for 3 years, and that the case had a crack in it, a specific crack related to evidence that only someone inside the Valkov estate might be positioned to access. I'm not an informant, Sophia said. Nobody starts out as an informant, Callahan said. They start out as someone who wants to protect their family. She had hung up. She had sat on the bathroom tile for a while, back against the tub, staring at the ceiling. Then she had gone to bed and stared at that for a while instead. She hadn't called back, but she hadn't deleted the number. The confrontation happened on a Thursday, 12 days after Marco arrived at the estate, 9 days after Sophia had begun working with Elena on the extended therapy protocol, and 3 hours after the perimeter sensors registered an unauthorized signal sweep from outside the eastern wall. Damien found Sophia in the garden just before dusk. She was helping Elena with her standing exercises, the new addition to their routine. 20 minutes of supported weight-bearing that Elena attacked with a ferocity that scared Dr. Park and impressed everyone else. Elena was gripping the garden rail with both hands, her knuckles white, her teeth set, refusing to sit back down despite the shaking in her knees. Damien watched for a moment. His face did something complicated. Then he looked at Sophia. Inside. Now. Elena, without releasing the rail, said, Whatever you need to say to her, you can say in front of me. I wasn't consulting you. No, you rarely do. Elena's voice was dry, controlled, undercutting him with the precision of a woman who had known him his entire life and had cataloged every technique he used to manage the people around him. "Go ahead, Damien. We're listening." He looked at Sophia. "You called a federal number 2 nights ago, a number associated with an active investigation." The air in the garden went still. Elena's hands tightened on the rail. Sophia's stomach dropped 6 inches, but her face held. She had grown up learning to absorb impact without showing it because showing it invited more. "You're monitoring my phone." "I'm monitoring every signal that enters and exits this property. I told you that when you arrived." "You told me there was security. You didn't tell me that included my personal calls." "It includes everything." His voice was flat, not angry. That was what made it worse. Anger would have been easier to push back against. This was the voice of a man who had already calculated the outcome and was relaying the results. "So who is he?" Damien said. "Someone who called me. I didn't seek him out." "But you called him back." She held his gaze. "I did. And?" "And I hung up without agreeing to anything." The garden was very quiet. Elena had stopped her exercises. She was standing against the rail, still gripping it, watching her son and this woman stand 6 feet apart in the fading October light and say things out loud that had been building for weeks. "I need to know if you're going to be a problem," Damien said. "I'm not a problem. I'm a person who received a phone call from a federal investigator telling me there's an active case with implications for this house, and I need to understand what I'm inside before I make decisions about staying inside it." She stepped closer. Not aggressive. Just unwilling to let distance do the work of avoidance. "You want loyalty from me, Damien. You want me here because you believe I'm someone who moves when it matters. But loyalty doesn't run on blind faith. It runs on truth. You told me about Victor Moreau because I pushed. You told me about the surveillance because I already knew. What else are you not telling me?" The muscle in his jaw moved. "This isn't the place. This is exactly the place. Because in 5 minutes your mother is going to be exhausted and cold, and I'm going to help her inside, and tomorrow morning I'm going to start this again. And I am not doing any of that without knowing what I'm actually protecting her from." Elena spoke from the rail, quietly, without drama. "Tell her, Damien." He looked at his mother. Something passed between them. Decades of unspoken negotiation, the specific gravity of a parent and child who had survived terrible things and were still, somehow, finding their way toward each other. He looked back at Sophia. "Inside. 10 minutes. After my mother is settled." Elena let Sophia help her back into the wheelchair without resistance, which itself was a statement. As Sophia pushed her toward the doors, Elena reached back and briefly covered Sophia's hand with her own. The 10 minutes became 25. Sophia helped Elena through her evening routine. The medications, the positioning, the small rituals of comfort that Elena had initially resisted and now accepted with the pragmatic grace of someone who had stopped fighting the evidence of her own needs. When she finally made it to Damien's office, he was standing at the window rather than sitting, which she had learned meant he was still deciding something. He told her. Not everything. She understood there were limits, and she wasn't asking for everything. He told her the shape of what the Moreau Syndicate actually controlled, the network of legitimate businesses that laundered its movement, the specific assets that Callahan's investigation was targeting, and the one thing that Damien had been sitting on for 6 months without knowing what to do with, a record. A ledger, digital, encrypted, sitting inside a server that Damien had seized from a Moreau operation 18 months ago. Evidence that could collapse Victor's legitimate cover completely and hand Callahan's investigation its ending. Then give it to them, Sophia said. It's not that simple. Why? Because handing that ledger to a federal investigation creates a chain of exposure that doesn't stop at Victor. It goes through networks that are intertwined with my operations. People who aren't Victor who would face consequences. People I have obligations to. So you're protecting criminals to protect criminals. His face tightened. I'm managing consequences. That's the same sentence. The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened between them since she had arrived. She could see him weighing it, the version of himself that managed and calculated and survived against the version that she was asking him to be. She didn't know which version would win. She wasn't sure she should have a preference, given that her continued safety depended on his capacity to manage exactly the kind of situation that managing was destroying. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Marco. She opened the text. 3 words. There's someone outside. And then a photograph. Taken through the window of his room, slightly blurred, the flash catching the edge of a face below in the dark courtyard. A man, standing still, looking up. Not a Valkov security guard. The uniforms didn't match. The posture didn't match. Sophia showed the phone to Damien. He looked at the photograph for 2 seconds, then picked up his own phone and was already talking before she could say anything, his voice sharp and very quiet. And in the hallway outside the office, she could hear the sudden movement of men changing their positions, the estate's security apparatus shifting from maintenance mode to something else entirely. She stood in the middle of the office with Marco's photograph on her phone screen and her heart doing something irregular in her chest and the full weight of what she had walked into finally, completely, settling through her in a way she could no longer rationalize away. She had accepted a job. She had packed a suitcase. She had pushed a wheelchair through a garden and played Aretha Franklin and watched an old woman remember what it felt like to be alive. And somewhere in the process, she had crossed a line she hadn't seen coming, past the point where leaving was still a simple decision, past the point where she could pack the suitcase back up and return to Washington Heights, and pretend the last 3 weeks had been a detour rather than a... The man in the courtyard was gone by the time Damien's security reached the ground floor. Not fled. Gone. The distinction mattered. Fleeing left traces, disturbed gravel, a direction, a heat signature on the thermal monitors. This left nothing. The courtyard cameras showed the man standing exactly where Marco's photograph had captured him, looking up at the window, and then, between one frame and the next, in the single second the rotating camera spent pointing elsewhere, he simply ceased to be there. No movement blur, no exit vector. Just presence, then absence, as clean as a word being erased. Damien stood in the security room watching the footage loop for the 3rd time. Sophia stood behind him. Neither of them spoke while the footage played, and then played again, and then a 3rd time, because repetition was what the brain did when it refused to accept what the eyes were delivering. He knew the camera rotation, Damien said. The head of security, a man named Brower, with a gray crew cut and 20 years of Eastern European military experience compressed into his posture, nodded once. Timed it to the second. Whoever placed him knew our schedule. How long has that rotation been active? 6 weeks. Who has access to the security schedule? Brower's pause was exactly 1 second too long. Damien turned from the screen. He looked at Brower the way a man looked at a door he had trusted for years and had just noticed the lock was wrong. Brower. The schedule is distributed to all senior security staff. 12 people. Names. Now. All 12. Sophia stepped back from the doorway. She stepped back not because she was afraid, but because she understood that what was about to happen in that room required a specific kind of space, and she was not part of the architecture of it. She went to Marco's room. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. Marco was sitting on the bed with his back against the headboard and his knees pulled up, his phone in both hands, his face doing the thing it did when he was performing calm over fear, the jaw slightly too set, the eyes slightly too still. "He's gone," Sophia said. "I know. I heard people moving outside." He looked at her. "Who was he?" "We don't know yet." "Is this going to keep happening?" She sat on the edge of the bed. The room was large and well-appointed and utterly wrong for Marco, who had grown up in a space so small that the boundary between bedroom and living room had been a bookshelf they'd found on the sidewalk. He looked reduced by the scale of it, a kid-sized thing in an adult-sized world. "I don't know," she said. She had stopped lying to him about uncertainty approximately 4 years ago, when she had realized that her attempts to cushion truth were teaching him that reality required softening, which was a lesson she couldn't afford him to learn. Should we leave? She had been asking herself this since the moment Damien's phone had gone to his ear. The argument for leaving was clean. Take Marco, call Carmen's home nurse, find somewhere Victor Moreau had no reason to look. The argument against it was what stopped her. Elena, alone in her room at the end of this hallway, 3 years of isolation and damage behind her, and exactly enough emerging will to be dangerous to herself if it was suddenly unsupported. "Not yet," she said. Marco looked at her for a long moment. "You actually care about her, the old woman." "Don't call her that. You know what I mean." "Yes," Sophia said. "I actually care about her." He nodded. He didn't push it further. He was 17, and he understood that his sister's decisions about what to care about were not always navigable from the outside. She left him with the door unlocked and went back into the hallway and nearly walked into Damien, who was moving in the opposite direction with Brower 2 steps behind him, and an expression that had moved past controlled into something harder and colder underneath. "One of the 12, she said. "Not a question." "We're working through it." "How?" "The way these things get worked through." He met her eyes briefly. The meaning was not ambiguous. She let it go. There were parts of this world she was going to have to accept without examining, because examining them would require her to make a decision she wasn't ready to make. "Is Elena secure?" "2 guards on her door. She knows something's happened. She's contained." "She's not a situation to be contained. I'll go to her." She went. Elena was awake, sitting up in bed with the lamp on, her silver braid over one shoulder and her hands folded in her lap, and her expression the expression of a woman who had received bad news so many times that her face had developed a specific configuration for it. Not surprised, not panicked, just present in a way that was also bracing. "Tell me," Elena said. Sophia told her. Not everything, but the relevant shape. A man in the courtyard, gone before security arrived. Someone inside who had provided access. Elena listened without interrupting. When Sophia finished, Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp, at the yellow circle it made on the ceiling. "Victor is introducing himself," she said. "That's what it felt like. He did this before. 3 years ago. Before the night on the road." Her voice was flat, factual, the tone of someone reading from a document they had memorized. "He sends a signal. Something small, something that says, 'I can reach you. I am already inside.' The message isn't the action. The message is that the action is coming and there is nothing you can do to stop knowing it." Sophia sat in the chair beside the bed. The same chair she sat in every evening when she helped Elena with the nighttime medication. The familiarity of the position felt strange now. The routine cracked down the middle. "Are you scared?" Sophia asked. Elena looked at her. "Yes." "Are you?" "Yes." "Good." Elena reached over and turned the lamp down a degree, not off. A concession to the dark without surrendering to it. Fear means we understand the situation clearly. The people who aren't scared in situations like this are the people who aren't paying attention. They sat in the half-dark for a while, not talking, not needing to. The next 48 hours were a lockdown that didn't call itself a lockdown. Additional security personnel arrived in 2 vehicles the following morning. Men Sophia hadn't seen before, harder edged than the estate's regular staff, with the practiced stillness of people who had spent time in environments where motion attracted consequences. The ground schedule changed. The kitchen deliveries were rerouted and screened. Marco's online school sessions were moved to a windowless interior room. The 12 names on Brower's list became 10, then 7, then 3, as the process of elimination, conducted in ways Sophia was not invited to witness and did not ask to understand, narrowed the field. By the second morning, 2 of the 3 remaining names had been cleared. The third was a guard named Revik, who had worked the estate's eastern perimeter for 14 months and who had not reported for his shift the morning after the courtyard incident. Revik was gone. His locker was clean. His room in the staff quarters had been cleared out with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared in advance. Not the sloppy aftermath of panic, but the careful erasure of someone who had known exactly which night would be the last one. Damien told Sophia this standing in the hallway outside Elena's room at 7 in the morning while the house was still waking up around them. He looked like he hadn't slept. He probably hadn't. He looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man operating close to the edge of what control could sustain. "How long was he working for Moreau?" she asked. "Brower thinks since before he was hired. A placement. Someone inside our vetting process helped him through." So the breach goes deeper. Yes. She absorbed this. The implications stacked themselves in her mind with the grim efficiency of someone accustomed to calculating bad arithmetic. You need to give Callahan the ledger. His jaw tightened. We talked about this. We talked about why it was complicated. We didn't talk about what happens when the complications run out of road. She kept her voice low, steady, not combative. This wasn't the moment for combat. This was the moment for precision. You have evidence that can end Victor's operation. You're sitting on it to protect people in your own network who would face collateral consequences. I understand that. I'm not dismissing it. But Victor already has someone inside your house, Damien. He's not waiting. He's already moving. If I hand that ledger to a federal investigation, the fallout is survivable. Unlike whatever Victor is planning. She stopped, then more quietly. I called Callahan back. The hallway went very still. She had called him the previous night, from the bathroom, sitting on the tile again, back against the tub again. She had told Callahan she needed more information before she could have any further conversation. He had told her the investigation was at a point where a single piece of evidence could determine whether Victor faced federal prosecution or walked free to consolidate everything he was building. He had told her the ledger's existence was known, not its contents, not its location, but its existence. He had told her that if the ledger reached him through official channels, the exposure it created for connected parties could be managed. Minimized. Chapit. She had asked him what minimized meant in terms of the people in Damien's network who would face consequences. He had told her, not immunity, but context, cooperation credit. The architecture of outcomes that federal investigators built for people who chose the right side before the door closed. She had asked how long the door stayed open. He had said, not long. Damien listened to all of this without expression. When she finished, the silence between them had a texture to it, dense, pressurized, the silence of a man deciding something large. You went around me, he said. I went around a decision you weren't making. This is my operation, my family, my... She's not just your mother. Sophia's voice stayed level. She is a person who was put in a wheelchair because Victor Moreau wanted to hurt you, and she has spent 3 years paying the price of your war, and she is just now, finding her way back to something. Do not let him take that from her a second time, because you couldn't let go of something you're protecting out of obligation to people who are not in this house. The words landed. She watched them land. She watched Damien absorb them the way a man absorbed a punch he'd seen coming and had decided not to avoid. He didn't answer. He turned and walked toward his office. She watched him go and thought, I don't know if that was right. She thought it with complete honesty, without the comfort of certainty, which was the only way she knew how to think about decisions that mattered. It was Elena who found her 2 hours later in the garden, standing at the rose beds in her jacket, with her hands in her pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. Elena had asked one of the guards to bring her wheelchair outside, which she had not done without Sophia's assistance before. She had managed the threshold and the path herself. With 2 guards hovering at a distance, she was clearly tolerating rather than welcoming. You look like someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong, Elena said. Something like that. Come here. Elena gestured to the stone bench beside the path. Sophia sat. Elena maneuvered her wheelchair alongside it, close enough that their proximity felt deliberate. I heard some of what you said to Damien, the walls here, as I mentioned. I know. You told him the truth. I told him what I thought was true. I'm not sure those are always the same. Elena was quiet for a moment, looking at the bare rose canes, the thorns winter exposed and stark against the pale sky. He has never trusted anyone outside our family. Not one once. In his entire life. She paused. He is considering trusting you with something he has never trusted anyone with. That is not a small thing for a man like him. I know. Don't mistake it for weakness. He is not weak. He is rearranging. Before Sophia could answer, her phone buzzed. Damien. A text. 3 words. Office, both of you. Elena looked at Sophia's phone. Then she looked up. Help me inside, she said. The office held 3 people when they arrived, Damien, Brower, and a man Sophia didn't recognize. Mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, A suit that was expensive but not showy. A face that wore its intelligence like a tool rather than an ornament. "This is Soren," Damien said. "He manages my legal interests. He has been reviewing the ledger for the past 6 hours." Soren looked at Sophia. Not at Elena. At Sophia. With an assessment that was also a question. "The ledger is what Callahan says it is," Soren said. He spoke carefully, each sentence a structure he had tested before offering. "If it reaches a federal investigation through proper channels, it creates a case against Victor Moreau that he cannot survive. Prosecutorial, institutional, the kind of dismantling that doesn't require the risk of direct confrontation." "And the collateral exposure?" Sophia asked. Soren glanced at Damien. Damien nodded. "Significant, but shapeable. If we initiate contact and frame the handover correctly, cooperation credit creates room, not immunity. Room." "Then we do it," Elena said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She had her hands folded in her lap and her chin up, and the expression of a woman who had arrived at a decision by a route that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with 3 years in a wheelchair. "Elena," Damien started. "I was on that road because I refused to accept that my life had to be managed by fear. I made a mistake. I paid for it." Her voice was steady and completely without self-pity. "I am not going to sit in this room and watch you make the same mistake because you can't let go of structures that are already killing us." She looked at her son. "Give them the ledger, Damien. Give it to Callahan. Let the law do what law is designed to do, and then let's be done with this." The room was quiet. Damien looked at his mother for a long time. Sophia watched his face move through things she couldn't name. Old grief, old anger, the complicated calculus of a man who had built a world on the premise that trust was a liability and was being asked to revise the equation. He looked at Soren. "Draft the contact protocol. Use the back channel we discussed. I want Callahan briefed before nightfall." Soren nodded and left. Brower's phone went off. He looked at it. Something in his posture changed, an almost imperceptible shift, a fraction of an inch of stillness that was the physical equivalent of a held breath. He looked up. "We have a problem." "What kind?" "The kind where we need to move Mrs. Valkov to the secure interior room. Now." Damien was already moving. "What triggered?" "Eastern perimeter, multiple vehicles." Brower was on his radio now, the words clipped and rapid in a language Sophia half understood. "They're not stopping at the gate." The next 4 seconds happened in the specific slow motion of crisis, the way extreme threat compressed time into something granular and strange, each moment arriving with the hyper-detail of things that might be the last things seen. Sophia was beside Elena's wheelchair before she had made a conscious decision to move. She had Elena's handles in her hands and was already turning toward the door. The explosion hit the eastern wall. Not close enough to break windows, close enough to feel through the floor. A concussive pressure that traveled through the building's bones and arrived in Sophia's feet and moved up through her knees and her spine and stopped somewhere behind her sternum as a vibration that had no sound left by the time it got there. The lights went out. The emergency lighting came on, red-tinged, casting the office in a color that made everyone look like they were already inside something that had gone badly wrong. "Move," Damien said. They moved. The service corridor was a route Sophia knew because she had walked it every day, learning the architecture of the house the way she had learned everything she had ever needed to learn, by paying attention while other people assumed she wasn't. Elena's wheelchair moved faster than it had any right to on the narrow corridor floor, Sophia's hands on the handles, her feet certain, her breathing controlled because panic was a luxury that had a body count. Behind them, the sound of the estate's security system engaging. Alarms, heavy door locks, the mechanical clangor of protocols activating in sequence. Ahead, the sound of men running, the estate's defenders repositioning toward a threat that was coming from the direction they had least expected. Damien was on his phone. His voice was a rapid, low-pitched series of commands. Brower was 10 steps ahead, his weapon drawn, clearing the corridor in the method of someone who had done this in an environment significantly more dangerous than a Westchester estate. The safe room was at the end of the north corridor, behind a door that looked like a supply closet and required a 6-digit code and Damien's thumbprint. He got them there in 4 minutes. He opened the door. "Inside," he said. Elena went in. Marco, who had been retrieved from his room by one of the guards 2 minutes earlier and had arrived at the safe room 30 seconds ahead of them, was already inside, sitting on a bench against the wall with his hands on his knees and his face performing calm over something that was not calm. Sophia started to follow Elena through the door. "Sophia." Damien's hand on her arm. Brief, firm, then released. "I'm going to end this tonight. Whatever happens, I need you to know that what you said this morning was—" He stopped. He was not a man who finished sentences like that one. He had not built the architecture for it. "Stay with her." "I know," she said. He turned and went back down the corridor. The heavy door of the safe room closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling. The safe room was 12 feet by 15, ventilated, stocked, lit by a steady white light that had none of the red emergency tinge of the corridor. There was water, medical supplies, communications equipment, a monitor showing 4 security camera feeds from outside. Sophia looked at the feeds. On the eastern camera, 2 vehicles had breached the outer wall. The grounds were full of movement. Damien's security team, engaging, holding the perimeter. On the northern camera, nothing. On the western, nothing. On the southern, she leaned closer. On the southern feed, there was a figure she recognized. Not from the courtyard. From the gala, 3 weeks ago. A face at the edge of her memory, a man who had been part of the catering staff, standing near the kitchen entrance, watching table 14 with an attention that had registered and then been filed and forgotten. Not catering staff. He had never been catering staff. He was inside the house. And he was walking with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, not toward the sound of the breach on the eastern perimeter, but away from it, toward the north corridor, toward the supply closet that looked like a supply closet and was not. Sophia looked at the communications panel on the wall. She found the channel for Damien's security team. She opened it. Nothing. Dead. The signal sweep from outside had taken the interior communications offline. She looked at Marco. He had seen the feed. His face had gone completely still in the way it went still when he was processing something that had no good interpretation. She looked at Elena, who was watching the southern camera feed with the eyes of a woman who had learned, 3 years ago and at catastrophic cost, exactly what it meant when someone moved through a familiar environment like they had memorized its blueprint. "He's been here before," Elena said. Her voice was very quiet. "That man. He knows this house." Sophia looked at the door, at the 6-digit code panel, at the thumbprint reader. The thumbprint reader required Damien's thumb, or the thumb of anyone who had been enrolled in the system during the security setup. Enrolled, for example, by a head of security who had been managing the estate for 6 years and whose access protocols covered the entire property, and who had been in this room 14 months ago when a guard named Revik was hired, and whose name had been on a list of 12, and who had stood in Damien's office 3 hours ago and received news about Revik's disappearance with a 1-second pause that Sophia had noticed and not yet understood. Brower. The pause hadn't been because he was processing the news. It had been because he already knew. The panel beside the door made a sound, a low electronic tone, the kind a system made when it was reading a credential it recognized. Sophia grabbed Elena's wheelchair and put it behind her, between the door and the back wall, and put herself between the chair and the door, and felt Marco move up beside her without being asked, the two of them shoulder to shoulder in front of Elena the way they had stood in front of their mother's bed the night a man had come to the Washington Heights apartment demanding money their father had owed, and which they had not had 12 years ago, 2 children in a dark hallway choosing to stand in. The door opened inward. Sophia had positioned herself 6 feet back from the threshold, which gave her exactly enough room to move and not enough room to run, which was fine because running had stopped being an option approximately 40 seconds ago when she had understood what Brower's 1-second pause had meant. The man who came through the door first was not Brower. He was the man from the southern camera feed, medium height, dark jacket, moving with the specific economy of someone trained to enter rooms that contained people who didn't want to be found. He had something in his right hand that Sophia registered peripherally and refused to look at directly because looking at it would subdivide her attention, and her attention needed to stay whole. Marco moved left. She moved right. It was not a plan. They had not had time for a plan. It was the instinct of two people who had grown up in the same small spaces and had learned, without ever discussing it, how to split a room. The man hesitated. He had expected the wheelchair, the old woman, possibly a caregiver. He had not expected the caregiver to be standing 4 feet off his entry line with her weight forward and her hands loose at her sides, and her eyes on his center mass rather than his face. That half-second of hesitation was the only thing Sophia had. She threw the water pitcher from the supply shelf. Not at him, past him, at the wall to his left, because the sound and the motion pulled his eyes in that direction for the fraction of a second she needed, and in that fraction she closed the distance and hit him across the forearm with the metal first aid kit she had pulled from the shelf with her other hand while he was watching the pitcher. The thing in his right hand, she understood now it was a zip tie, not a weapon. Victor wanted them alive and manageable. Dropped when his forearm took the impact. He recovered fast, faster than she expected, and his left hand caught her by the jacket collar and momentum carried them both into the supply shelving, which gave way in a crash of metal and scattered equipment. She heard Elena's voice behind her, sharp, commanding. "Marco, the panel!" She heard Marco move. The man had her against the collapsed shelving, his forearm across her collarbone, his weight leveraged to hold her still. He was bigger than her by 50 pounds of functional muscle. She was not going to win this on strength. She knew that with the clarity of someone who had spent 28 years understanding the precise terms of what they were working with. She stopped resisting backward. She went forward instead, into him, removing the distance that his leverage required, making the forearm press useless because there was no longer space for it to function. Her forehead connected with his nose. Not a movie headbutt, nothing clean or choreographed. A brutal, graceless collision that hurt her as much as it hurt him, and that she did not allow herself to feel until later, much later, in a version of this night that she couldn't access yet because she was still inside the current one. He reeled. She went around him, not through him, toward the door. The second man was in the doorway. Brower was behind him. Brower was not in tactical gear. He was in his usual dark clothes, his expression arranged into something that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite managing it. Not guilt, not quite, but the nearest approximation available to a man who had probably told himself a particular story about necessity and loyalty long enough that he had stopped examining whether the story was true. "Sophia," Brower said. His voice was the same voice it had always been. That was the worst part. "How long?" Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Step back from the door. "How long, Brower?" His jaw moved. "Before Revik, before any of this. Victor and I go back to a time before Damien." He paused. "This was never personal. You let Revik into this house. You gave him the camera schedule. You cleared him through vetting." She could feel the man she'd hit getting back to his feet behind her. She didn't look. Looking would be an invitation. Elena almost died 3 years ago because of information someone fed to Victor's people about her rote. Was that you too? The answer was in the half-second before he spoke. In the way his eyes moved to Elena and then moved away. "Step back," he said. "No." The second man moved through the doorway. Marco hit him. Not effectively. Marco was 17 and had no training, and what he had was desperation and a fire extinguisher he had pulled from the wall mount, which he swung with both hands in a horizontal arc that caught the man across the shoulder rather than where Marco had aimed. But it was enough. The man stumbled into Brower. Brower caught him. The doorway was blocked for 2 seconds. Sophia grabbed Marco's arm and pulled him back toward Elena, putting the overturned shelving between them and the door, and then Elena's hand was on her wrist, and Elena's grip was the same grip it had been at the gala. Surprisingly strong, the grip of a woman who had danced for 20 years and whose hands remembered strength even when the rest of her body was still relearning it. "They won't hurt us in here," Elena said quietly, directly into Sophia's ear. "Victor needs us functional. We're leverage, not targets. The moment they damage us, we lose our value." That's not as comforting as you think it is. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to tell you to stop fighting long enough for Damien to get here. What if Damien doesn't? He will. Her grip tightened. He always comes, even when I wish he wouldn't. Brower's voice from the doorway. "We're done with the difficult part. Come out from behind there, all three of you. Nobody gets hurt in this room. Sophia looked at Marco. His shoulder was bleeding where the shelving edge had caught him when he swung. Not badly. He was holding the fire extinguisher with both hands still, his knuckles white, his breathing the breathing of someone who had used everything he had and was looking for where the next supply was coming from. She looked at him, and she thought, I brought him here. I made this choice and I brought him into it. She came out from behind the shelving. Good, Brower said. Tell me one thing. She stood in the center of the room. Marco came up beside her. Elena's wheelchair was behind them. The gala. 3 weeks ago. Was that Victor's people in the catering staff? Was all of it? Was I? You were convenient, Brower said. Not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Victor's been looking for a way to insert someone into Damien's inner circle for 2 years. You were an opportunity that walked through the door. What you did at that gala was real. Victor just decided to use it. She absorbed this. She filed it in the part of her mind that handled information too large to process immediately. The same place she had put her father's absence and her mother's diagnosis and every other thing that had arrived without warning and required eventual reckoning. They were moved through the corridor, through the house, through the ground floor, and into the section Sophia had never accessed, the older part of the building, the original stone structure predating the renovations, where the walls were thick and the windows were narrow and the acoustics swallowed sound and returned nothing. A room that had probably been a cellar storage space and had been converted, at some point, into something that served a function Sophia didn't want to name. Victor Moreau was already there. She didn't know what she had expected. Power had a way of conjuring physical presence and imagination that the actual person rarely matched. Victor Moreau was 60, lean, with white hair worn short, and the complexion of someone who spent time outdoors in cold weather. He was sitting in a chair, just a chair, pulled from somewhere, no theatrical staging, with his jacket on and his hands relaxed in his lap, as if he had been waiting patiently for an appointment he had known would keep itself. His eyes moved to Elena first, then to Sophia, then, briefly, to Marco, with the assessment of someone pricing an item they had no particular emotional connection to. Elena. His voice was mild, conversational, the voice of a man at a dinner party. You look better than I expected. Elena said nothing. Her hands were in her lap, and her face was the face Sophia had come to understand as Elena's war face. Not blank, not afraid, but closed, occupied. Working on something interior that wasn't available to the people in the room. Victor looked at Sophia. You've been busier than we anticipated. The call to Callahan. That was faster than we estimated. He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded like a man noting an interesting variable. Damien's been sitting on that ledger for 18 months. You've been in his house for 3 weeks, and he was about to hand it over. He tilted his head slightly. What did you say to him? The truth? He looked at her with the expression of someone encountering a type they recognized but still found faintly remarkable. You're not what I expected either. Most people in your situation spend their energy being frightened. You spend yours being useful. Tell me what you want. I want Damien to understand the terms clearly before he makes a decision that can't be unmade. He stood, not aggressively, just repositioning, the way a person moved in a space they considered their own. I'm going to make a call. Damien is going to answer. He's going to hear your voice and Elena's voice so he understands the conversation is happening in the appropriate context. And then he is going to make a choice about the ledger and about what he does with Callahan, and that choice will determine what the rest of this evening looks like. And if he doesn't make the choice you want? Victor looked at her. His expression didn't change. It didn't need to. The room did the work. The stone walls, the narrow windows, the distance from anywhere that help could arrive quickly. Midnight, he said. He has until midnight. The call lasted 4 minutes. Sophia spoke first. She said her name. She said she was unharmed. She said Marco was unharmed. She said Elena was with her. She kept her voice level because level was the only tone that served any purpose in this moment. Panic would destabilize Damien, and destabilized men made fast decisions, and fast decisions in this situation had a particular kind of cost. Elena spoke next. She said, "Do not give him anything." Her voice was the most controlled thing in the room. "Do you hear me, Damien? Do not?" Victor took the phone. The conversation after that was between the two men, in the flat, precise register of people who had been opponents long enough to have dispensed with performance. Sophia could hear Damien's voice from across the room, but not the words. She watched Victor's face for information and found almost none, because Victor had a face that gave information on its own schedule and not before. Victor ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Sophia. He wants confirmation you're uninjured. I told him that. He wants visual confirmation. Victor nodded to one of his men, who produced a phone and took a photograph. Sophia, Marco, Elena, the room, the specific geometry of captivity that would communicate everything to Damien that words had left ambiguous. The photograph was sent. Then they waited. The room was cold, the kind of cold that came from stone and age rather than temperature. A structural cold, something the building had absorbed over decades and never released. Sophia could feel it through her jacket, through the chair she'd been told to sit in, rising through the seat and into her back. She didn't show it. Showing it was giving the room something she wanted to keep. Marco was beside her. His shoulder had been looked at by one of Victor's men, perfunctorily, without particular care, but looked at, and deemed superficial, which it was. He was sitting with his hands in his lap now, the fire extinguisher confiscated, his face in the performing calm configuration. Sophia caught his eye once. She gave him the smallest possible movement of her chin. A nod that meant, I know, I see you, hold on. He gave it back. Elena had said nothing since the phone call. She was sitting in her wheelchair in the precise center of the space Victor's men had positioned her in, and she was doing something with her face that Sophia had only seen twice before. A specific kind of inward withdrawal, not the grief withdrawal of the early weeks, but something more deliberate. Focused, the expression of a woman spending the time she had in the way that would matter most. She was moving her feet, not visibly, not in a way that anyone looking at her from the front would register. But Sophia was at an angle and she could see Elena's right foot inside the wheelchair's footrest. A small, deliberate flexion, the ankle rotating, the physical therapy sequence she ran through every morning and every evening, and sometimes in the middle of the night when Sophia heard her through the wall. The sequence that had taken 3 months to reach and another 2 months to stabilize. The exercise built for one purpose, the redistribution of controlled weight. She was not sitting in that wheelchair waiting to be saved. She was preparing. Sophia looked away from Elena's feet before anyone could follow her gaze. She looked at the wall. She looked at the narrow window. She looked at the distribution of Victor's men in the room. 2 by the door, 1 near Victor, 1 near the far wall. Brower somewhere behind them in a position that suggested a man who had already made his calculation and was now living inside the aftermath of it. The man she had hit with the first aid kit was standing near the door with a bruise developing across his forearm and an expression that communicated clearly that he had updated his assessment of what she was. Midnight was 47 minutes away. At 43 minutes, the power went out. Not the estate's emergency system this time, that had been overridden when Victor's people took the control room. This was different. This was the specific surgical darkness of something cut from outside, from a point in the grid that no one inside the estate controlled. Callahan, Sophia thought. Or Damien, using a channel she didn't know about. The darkness lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. She heard Elena's wheelchair move. Not rolling, tipping, the specific controlled forward lean of someone redistributing their weight over their feet. The motion that Dr. Park had described in the exact terminology of transfer. Pelvis forward, spine vertical, weight into the balls of the feet. The moment of commitment that preceded standing. 3 seconds of darkness. Then the emergency lighting came on, red-edged, casting the room in its crisis color. Elena Valkov was standing, not steadily. Her hands were gripping the armrests. Her knees were shaking. The physical effort of it was visible in every line of her body, in the locked jaw and the white-knuckled grip, and the breathing that was 3 years of physical therapy compacted into a single moment of pure, furious will. But she was standing, and in the half-second that Victor's men spent processing this, the impossible thing, the woman they had assessed as immobile, who had been transported in a wheelchair and positioned as a passive element of the leverage equation, standing in the red emergency light like an accusation. In that half-second, she moved. Not far. 2 steps, using the wheelchair as a pivot, her body executing the movement on instinct and training and something beyond both. Momentum toward the man nearest to her, the man by the far wall, her hands releasing the armrest and finding the metal tray on the supply shelf she had already mapped from her position and knew was within reach. She hit him across the face with it. It was not a powerful blow. Elena Valkov was 62 years old and had spent 3 years losing muscle mass and 2 months rebuilding a fraction of it. The force was not the point. The point was the sound, the shock, the sudden loud statement of violence from the direction everyone had classified as passive. The man stumbled backward. Elena lost her footing and went down, catching herself on the shelf edge, not falling all the way, holding on with both hands. Sophia was already moving. She had been waiting. Not consciously, not with a plan, but with the same thing Elena had been doing. Preparation. The readiness that lived in the muscles before the mind confirmed the decision. She went for the man nearest the door. Not the one Elena had hit, but the other, the one whose position between them and the exit was the only thing that mattered in the next 4 seconds. She hit him once, hard, with everything she had behind it, and she felt it all the way up her arm to her shoulder and through her back, and she thought clearly and without drama, that's going to hurt later. He went sideways. Not down, sideways. Marco hit him from the other direction, not the fire extinguisher this time. His shoulder lowered, full body weight, the kind of collision that wasn't fighting so much as physics. 2 objects meeting and one of them being larger than it had appeared. The man went down. The door was open. "Go," Sophia said. "Elena," Marco started. "I have her. Go. Straight ahead. Find a stairwell. Go up." She got back to Elena. Elena's grip on the shelf edge was still solid. Her legs were shaking hard now, the muscular effort of the previous 30 seconds having burned through the reserves she'd built. Sophia got her arm around her waist from the left side, taking the weight, and Elena's arm went around Sophia's shoulders, and they moved together toward the door in the specific awkward synchrony of 2 people who had spent weeks learning how the other body worked. Behind them, Victor's voice. "Don't." Not shouting, commanding, the voice of a man accustomed to that being sufficient. Sophia didn't look back. She could hear movement behind her, 2 of Victor's men recalibrating, and she could hear the door ahead of her, and she could feel Elena's breathing against her shoulder, ragged and fierce and very much alive. And she moved. The corridor outside the room was dim and narrow. Marco was 12 feet ahead, turned back, waiting, his face stripped of the performing calm and showing only the bare material underneath, fear, determination, and the specific expression of a 17-year-old who had decided to be equal to the moment. "Stairwell's left," he said. "I can see the door. Go." They went. Sophia half carrying Elena, Marco ahead clearing the path, the 3 of them moving through the corridor in the red-edged dark with the sounds of Victor's men behind them, and the sounds of the estate above them, and the sounds of something else. Engines, voices, the organized percussion of a structure under assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Damien's people. She understood it the way she had understood everything tonight, not through information but through pattern, through the reading of sounds, the way she had learned to read Elena's breathing, the way she read Marco's face, the way she had read Brower's 1-second pause. The stairwell door was metal, heavy, and unlocked. Marco got it open. They went through. The stairwell was concrete, utilitarian, the functional skeleton of the building beneath its stone skin. Light came from a single fixture on each landing, white and steady and blessedly normal after the red emergency tinting of the floors below. Sophia got Elena to the first landing. Elena was breathing in the hard, controlled way of someone managing pain, not expressing it, managing it, treating it as information rather than experience. "Can you go up?" "I can go anywhere," Elena said through her teeth. "That's not an answer to the question I asked." A sound from below, the metal door they had come through, opening. "Yes," Elena said. "I can go up." They went up. The second floor was where the corridor fight reached them first. Not directly, but acoustically, the sounds filtering through walls and floor, the systematic violence of Damien's strike team working through the lower level in the specific organized pattern of men who knew the building and had planned their entry with the assumption that the people they were coming for would be somewhere in the center of it. Sophia stopped at the second-floor landing. She looked at Marco. He looked at her. "We need to signal them," she said. "They're clearing room by room. They don't know we're mobile." "How?" She looked at Elena. Elena looked at the light fixture on the wall, at the power panel beside it, the secondary circuit breaker for the floor. "If I kill the light on this floor," Elena said, "it's different from the rest of the building. It signals a position." "You know where the panel is?" "I have lived in this house for 30 years. Elena's voice was dry, even now, even here, with her arm around Sophia's shoulders and her legs shaking and the sound of pursuit 2 floors below. "I know where everything is." She reached the panel. Her hands were not steady. They worked anyway. The second floor went dark. Below them, the stairwell door opened again. Footsteps on concrete moving up. Not the organized sound of Damien's men, but the faster, less disciplined sound of pursuit. Victor's man, maybe 2, coming through the only vertical channel in the building that wasn't yet controlled. Sophia pressed Elena against the wall. She pressed Marco against it on the other side. She stood between them and the stairwell, and she breathed once, deep, all the way down. The footsteps reached the landing below. A flashlight beam swept up through the stairwell opening. A voice from above. "Clear!" Not Victor's man. Not pursuit. Damien's voice. And then Damien himself, descending fast from the floor above, a flashlight in one hand, his other hand already reaching for her in the dark, and behind him 2 of his men, and the sound of the building's lower floors going suddenly and completely quiet in the way that only happened when something decisive had been concluded. He reached her. His hand found her face in the dark. Not gentle, not slow, the grip of a man checking the reality of a thing he had been afraid he would not find. She felt his thumb against her cheekbone and his fingers at her jaw, and the specific tremor in his hands that a man like Damien Valkov would never acknowledge, and that she would never mention, and that was the most honest thing she had felt from him since the night in the sedan on Lexington Avenue. "Elena," he said. His voice was fractured in a way she hadn't heard before. "Here." Elena's voice, from 2 feet to Sophia's right. Steady, still steady. He let go of Sophia's face. He moved past her, and she heard the sound of him reaching his mother, heard Elena's sharp exhale, and then the silence that followed, the specific silence of 2 people holding on to each other in the dark. Marco pressed close to Sophia's side. She put her arm around him and felt him exhale, the long, slow release of a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time. Below them, footsteps, coming up the stairs. Multiple sets, controlled, organized, with the measured pace of people who had completed their task and were now performing the work of aftermath. One of Damien's men appeared in the stairwell opening, flashlight angled down. "Mr. Valkov, western wing is secured. Lower level is secured." A pause. "We have Brower." Damien's arm was still around Elena. His voice, when he spoke, had returned to its controlled register, but only the surface of it. Underneath, Sophia could hear what 3 years of not showing fear did to a person's voice when the fear finally had somewhere to go. "Victor?" "East corridor. He's contained. He's asking to negotiate." Damien looked at Sophia. In the darkness and the single beam of the flashlight coming from below, she could see his face, the stone surface of it, the control, and beneath that the thing she had seen once before, in his office, when he had looked at Elena and rearranged something essential. "There's nothing to negotiate," he said. But Victor Moreau was not a man who accepted endings that other people wrote for him. And in the east corridor, contained between 4 of Damien's men, with his jacket still on and his hands zip-tied in front of him, and his expression the expression of a man who had lost a battle but not yet decided about the war, Victor looked at the phone in his breast pocket, the one that none of Damien's men had yet thought to confiscate because they were focused on his hands and not on the device that contained the secondary trigger, the failsafe he had built into this night 18 months ago, the thing he had always known he would need if. The phone was in Victor's breast pocket, and his hands were zip-tied in front of him, and none of that was as reassuring as it should have been. Damien understood this the moment his man said, "East Corridor." He understood it the way he understood most dangerous things. Not through reasoning, but through the accumulated instinct of 20 years spent in rooms with people who had contingencies built into their contingencies. Victor had been in this business longer than Damien. Victor had survived 4 attempts on his operation, 2 federal investigations, and the particular kind of sustained warfare that destroyed most men before they reached 50. He had not survived all of that by accepting the premise that being physically contained was the same as being defeated. Damien handed Elena to Sophia. The exchange was wordless, a transfer of weight and responsibility that both women accepted without discussion. He looked at Sophia once, not long, not theatrical, just long enough to communicate that he needed her to stay where she was and that he understood what asking her to stay where she was cost. She nodded. He went down. The east corridor was a 40-foot stretch of original stone flooring that connected the old wing to the renovation, lit now by the portable lights his men had set up. Bright, white, functional, casting sharp shadows and eliminating the atmospheric ambiguity that darkness provided to people who wanted to use it. Victor stood in the center of this light, between 2 of Damien's men, zip-tied and jacket on and entirely too composed for a man whose operation had just collapsed around him floor by floor. Damien stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Victor the way you looked at something you had been tracking for a long time and had finally cornered, not with satisfaction, because there was no satisfaction in it, only the exhausted recognition that the tracking was over and the thing after the tracking was harder. "The phone," Damien said. Victor's eyes moved to his breast pocket and back. A confirmation, not a question. "The phone, Victor." "There's a number stored in it," Victor said. His voice was the same dinner party voice it had been in the stone room. Unhurried, oriented toward the long game even now, even here. "One outgoing call in the last 30 minutes. I made it when your people entered the West Wing. The person who received that call is waiting for a follow-up. If they don't receive it within—" He glanced at his watch, the gesture unhurried, the gesture of a man who had all the time that mattered. 11 minutes, they proceed. Proceed with what? "Your mother's medical records have been in a server I control for 14 months. Every medication she takes, every dosage. The names of the 2 private pharmacies that fill her prescriptions." He paused. "There's a person at each of those pharmacies tonight, waiting for my call." The corridor was very quiet. Damien could hear his own breathing. He could hear the distant sounds of his men finishing their sweep of the lower floors, the systematic clearing of spaces that had already been cleared, the professional redundancy of men who didn't trust first passes. "You're threatening a sick woman's medication," Damien said. "I'm explaining the terms of the current situation. There's a difference." Victor tilted his head slightly. "The ledger. I know you were preparing to hand it to Callahan. I know you made the decision tonight. I need you to unmake it." He paused. "The call is mine to make. If I make it, the people at those pharmacies go away. If I don't make it in 11 minutes, they don't." Damien looked at the phone in Victor's breast pocket. He looked at his man on Victor's left. He looked at the floor between them, at the stone that was 300 years old and had absorbed the weight of everything that had ever happened in this building and would absorb this too, indifferently, the way stone absorbed everything. He took 1 step forward. Victor's men, his men now, the 2 holding Victor, shifted their weight. Victor didn't move. He was watching Damien's face with the attention of a man reading a document he had authored himself, looking for the response he had predicted. Damien reached into Victor's breast pocket and took the phone. Victor's composure cracked, not dramatically. A fraction, a hairline fracture in the surface of it, the specific expression of a man whose model has encountered a variable it didn't account for. "That's not— I know what you have in those pharmacies," Damien said. "I know because Brower told you about my mother's prescriptions, and Brower got that information from our medical coordinator, whose communications I have been monitoring for 6 weeks." He turned the phone over in his hand. "The number you called tonight, I know whose it is, and I know they've already been picked up, because I made that call 40 minutes ago." The corridor absorbed this. Victor was quiet for 4 seconds. 5. The dinner party voice, when it returned, had lost something underneath it. Not the surface held, but the deep structural confidence that had been its foundation. "You're lying." "Call the number," Damien said. He held the phone out. "Go ahead. I cut your hands free, you call it. See who answers." Victor looked at the phone. He looked at Damien. He looked at the phone again. And in that second look, Sophia, who had come down the stairs without permission, without announcement, because she was constitutionally incapable of waiting in a stairwell while the thing she needed to understand was happening 40 feet away, saw it. The calculation failing, the model revising, the predator encountering the edge of the territory he had mapped and finding that the map was wrong. Victor did not ask to call the number. Damien handed the phone to his man. Get it to Soren. He'll know what to do with the contacts. He looked at Victor for a moment longer. Just a moment. The look of a man closing a door. Take him somewhere he can wait for Callahan's people, he said. Comfortably. He's going to need to be coherent for the conversation. Victor was taken down the corridor. He walked without resistance, which was either dignity or the strategic conservation of energy for a fight that would happen in a different room with different weapons. Sophia thought it was probably both. Brower was brought out 20 minutes later, from the room where Damien's people had been holding him. He walked differently than Victor, not with composure but with the specific physical language of a man who had made a decision he couldn't unmake and was now living in the body of the person who had made it. His shoulders were forward. His eyes were on the floor. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated than shame. The aftermath of a long time spent believing a particular story about loyalty and necessity, and the story had ended, and what was left was just the man. Sophia was in the corridor when they brought him through. She hadn't planned to be. She had been moving toward the kitchen to find water because her mouth tasted like adrenaline and old copper, and she needed something ordinary, something that tasted like the world before tonight. Brower saw her. He stopped. His guards let him stop. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The night on the road, she said. 3 years ago. Elena. His jaw moved. I gave them the route. I didn't know they were going to... He stopped. I thought it was going to be a warning, something to make her turn back. I didn't know the car was going to... But you found out afterward. His eyes went somewhere else. Yes. And you stayed. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the previous 14 months of his life, in Revik's hiring, in the camera schedule, in 100 small decisions that had each felt manageable in isolation and had assembled themselves, in aggregate, into the thing he was now standing inside. I'm sorry, he said. Sophia looked at him for another moment. She thought about what sorry meant from a man who had handed Elena Valkov's route to the people who put her in a wheelchair. She thought about 3 years of physical therapy and a woman learning to lift a water glass and 2 months of standing exercises and Elena's face in the red light of the stairwell, standing, fierce, furious, alive. Tell that to her, Sophia said. Not to me. She walked past him to the kitchen. The water was cold and ordinary, and she drank 2 full glasses standing at the sink in a kitchen she had walked through 100 times in the past 3 weeks. And that looked exactly the same as it always had, which felt like either comfort or insanity, and she couldn't determine which. Marco found her there. He came in and sat on the counter the way he sat on the counter at home, the way he had since he was 9 years old and too tall for the kitchen table to feel like his territory. And he looked at his sister and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Are we okay? He asked. Define okay. Alive. Not arrested. More or less in one piece. Then yes, she said. We're okay. He nodded. He picked up an apple from the bowl on the counter, some detail of ordinary domestic life, the estate's kitchen stocked with fruit regardless of what was happening in its corridors, and bit into it and chewed and looked at the wall. I want to go home, he said. I know. Not tonight. I know not tonight, but soon, she said. We'll figure out what soon looks like. He nodded again. He ate the apple. She drank her water. The kitchen hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of Damien's people completing their work filled the space between them, and it was enough for the moment to be in a room that smelled like something other than stone and fear. Callahan arrived at 2 a.m. with 4 agents and a warrant, and the expression of a man who had been woken up with information so significant that he had driven 2 hours without registering the distance. He was shorter than Sophia had expected from his phone voice. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried a leather notebook that looked like it had been with him for a decade. and he moved through the estate with the careful attention of someone reading a room rather than entering it. He found Sophia in the sitting room off the main hall, where she had been for the past hour, sitting in the chair nearest the window with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. He sat across from her without being invited, which she decided to interpret as professional directness rather than rudeness. "The ledger," he said. No preamble. "Soren has it. Damien's legal counsel. He'll walk you through the handover protocol." She paused. "He'll want certain things documented. Cooperation context. We can discuss terms. Not terms. Documentation. There's a difference." She had learned that from Soren. She had learned a lot from Soren in the 4 days since she had first sat in Damien's office and been told about the ledger. She had not anticipated that one of the skills she would develop in a crime lord's estate in Westchester County would be a functional understanding of federal cooperation frameworks. But the night had been full of things she hadn't anticipated. Callahan looked at her with the assessing expression of a man recalibrating. "You've been busy." "I've been paying attention," she said. "It's what I do." The handover took 3 hours. Soren and Callahan's lead agent worked through it in the dining room, with Damien present for the portions that required his direct authorization and absent for the portions that Soren deemed better handled without him. Sophia sat in on the first 90 minutes, not because anyone invited her, but because she had been part of the chain of decisions that led to this table, and she intended to understand what she had put in motion. The ledger was what Callahan had said it was. 18 months of Moreau syndicate, financial movement, counterparty identifications, shell company structures, the specific architecture of how legitimate businesses had been used to move illegitimate money through a system that looked, on its surface, exactly like the kind of commerce that happened in the buildings she had spent her working life serving food inside. The exposure it created was, as Soren had said, significant and shapeable. The people in Damien's network who faced collateral consequences were named, documented, and assigned to a category of cooperation credit that Callahan's office would process through channels that Sophia didn't fully understand and chose to trust incrementally rather than absolutely. Victor Moreau was in federal custody before dawn. Brower was in a separate facility, in a category that Callahan's office described with a term Sophia had never heard before and which Soren translated, with the dry precision of a man who had spent 30 years translating institutional language into human terms, as significant cooperation, significant consequences, the exact ratio to be determined by how useful what he had to say turned out to be. The estate was quiet by 5 in the morning. The last of Callahan's people left at 5:15. The portable lights in the east corridor were removed. The stone floor in that corridor had a scuff mark near the center where something had fallen and been dragged, and a groundskeeper who arrived at 6:30 to begin the cleanup looked at it for a long moment before deciding it was something a stone floor would eventually absorb on its own, the way stone absorbed everything. Elena slept until 9. Sophia was outside her door when she woke up, not because she had been told to be, but because the habit of the past 3 weeks had built itself into her body's rhythm, the way all habits did if you did them long enough. Not a decision anymore, but a reflex, the body doing what it had learned to do. Elena opened her door before Sophia knocked. She was in her wheelchair. She had gotten herself into it from the bed alone, which was something Dr. Park had said was 4 to 6 weeks away. She looked at Sophia with the expression of a woman who had looked at a great many things over 62 years and had developed a comprehensive assessment system for all of them. "You stayed outside my door all night," Elena said. "I was in the hallway." "Yes, outside my door." Sophia didn't deny it. "How are you feeling?" "Like I stood up in a room full of people who didn't expect me to and hit a man with a tray?" A pause. "And like it was the most alive I've felt in 3 years." She moved her wheelchair back from the doorway. "Come in. Tell me what happened with Callahan." Sophia came in. She told her. Elena listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, with her hands folded and her eyes focused on something slightly past Sophia's shoulder, the posture of a person processing rather than receiving. When Sophia finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. "Brower," she said. "Yes." "He gave them the route." "Yes." Another quiet. The window light was thin and gray and November-colored, the kind of morning light that didn't flatter anything and somehow made everything more true. "I knew someone had," Elena said. "I always knew it wasn't random. A car doesn't find you on a private road at 11 at night by accident." She looked at her hands, at the knuckles that still showed faint bruising from gripping the wheelchair armrest in the stairwell. "I didn't know it was him." "Elena, I'm not asking you to tell me how to feel about it." Her voice was even, definitive. "I know how I feel. I'll feel it for a long time. That's mine to carry." She looked up. "What I want to know is whether it's over. Victor is in federal custody. The ledger gives Callahan's office what they need to build a case that lasts. Soren says the structure of it means there's no successor who can take over what Victor built. It's too exposed now, too documented. The Moreau Syndicate ends as an operational entity. And Damien's network? Complicated, but survivable. Soren's word." Elena absorbed this. She looked at the window. Outside, the November garden was bare and ordered and waiting for whatever came next. "He's going to want to change things," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "I think he's already changing them." "Yes." She turned back. "He has been since you arrived, actually. I've been watching. He thinks I haven't noticed, but I've been watching him for 35 years and I notice everything." The corner of her mouth moved, the ghost of the smile Sophia had first seen 3 weeks ago, but more solid now, more willing to arrive. "You did that." "I pushed a wheelchair and played Aretha Franklin." "You saw him." Elena said it simply, the way she said things that she had decided were simply true. "Everyone in his life sees what he controls. You saw what he was trying to become. There's a difference." Sophia looked at the window, at the bare garden, at the November light that didn't flatter anything. She thought about the night at the gala, the tray in her hands, the $63 in her apron pocket, the specific tired clarity of a woman who had run out of reasons to look away. She thought about the sedan on Lexington Avenue, and the card with the embossed phone number and the choice she had made at 7 in the morning at a kitchen table while her mother slept in a recliner and her brother pretended not to be afraid. She thought about what it cost to see people clearly and to act on what you saw, and about the fact that the cost had not been theoretical and that she would pay it again, which was either wisdom or stubbornness, and was probably both. "I should check on Marco," she said. "He was in the kitchen an hour ago," Elena said. "He ate a very large breakfast, and he looked considerably better. Your brother is more resilient than you give him credit for." "I give him a lot of credit." "You give him protection. It's not the same thing." Elena said it without accusation. Observation, precise, and offered without agenda. "He handled last night. He made choices. Let him know you saw that." Sophia stood. She stood for a moment at the edge of Elena's room, in the thin November light, with the events of the previous 24 hours settling through her the way sediment settled after a disturbance, slowly, still finding their final positions. "Mrs. Valkov," she said, "what you did in that room, getting up, hitting that man with the tray. It was a very poor blow. My form was terrible." "Your form was extraordinary." Elena looked at her. The smile arrived this time. Not the ghost of it, not the memory of the muscle movement, but the actual thing, lines deepening around her eyes and mouth, the specific beauty of a face that had survived enough to make happiness look like a decision rather than an accident. "Go find my son," she said. "He's been circling the hallway outside this door for 45 minutes, and he won't come in until someone tells him it's all right." Sophia went into the hallway. Damien was there. He was not circling. He was standing with his back against the opposite wall and his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who had been standing there long enough that the standing had become its own kind of occupation. His jacket was gone. His shirt had a tear at the shoulder from something in the east corridor. He looked like a man on the other side of a thing that had taken everything he had. She stood across from him. The hallway was narrow enough that 6 feet of distance felt like a conversation. "She's fine," Sophia said. "She's more than fine." Something moved through his face. The controlled surface of it, the management, the calculation, the stone, shifted in the way she had seen it shift twice before. First in the garden, looking at Elena doing her standing exercises. Second in the stairwell, in the dark, his hands finding her face. I heard her, he said. In that room. When she... He stopped. She stood up. She stood up. He said it quietly. Twice the weight of the same words. Sophia looked at the door to Elena's room and then back at him. She's waiting for you. She's been waiting for you to stop standing in the hallway. He looked at the door. He looked at Sophia. The question that passed between them was one neither of them put into words. There were things happening in this hallway that were larger than the events of the night and that would take considerably longer than the remaining morning to understand, and both of them knew it, and both of them were willing, for the moment, to let them be large and unresolved and real. Thank you, he said. She nodded. Go see your mother. He went. She heard the door open and Elena's voice, dry and immediate. You've been standing out there for 45 minutes. I could hear you breathing. And then Damien's voice, quieter than she had ever heard it, just 2 words, just her name, Mom. And then the door closed. Sophia walked to the end of the hallway and down the main stairs and through the entrance hall and out the front door of the Valkov estate into the November morning. The air was cold and sharp and smelled like soil and dying leaves and the particular mineral clarity of upstate New York at the edge of winter. The grounds were quiet. The security personnel were present, but reduced. The crisis formation had been dismantled. The ordinary rhythms of the estate reasserting themselves with the pragmatic efficiency of systems that had been designed to survive disruption. She sat on the front steps. The stone was cold through her jeans. She sat anyway. Marco came out 5 minutes later. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, the way they had sat on the stoop of the Washington Heights building on summer evenings when Carmen was sleeping and the apartment was too small for both of their silences. He had the last quarter of an apple in his hand, which she took and ate because she was suddenly, completely famished. What happens now? He asked. She chewed. She thought about it honestly, without the comfort of a prepared answer. Mom's medical coverage is secure through the arrangement with Damien's people. The debt is handled. Your tuition when the time comes is handled. She paused. What I do next is less clear. Do you want to stay here? She looked at the grounds. At the bare trees at the edge of the property, at the garden where she had pushed a wheelchair through October roses and played Aretha Franklin from a portable speaker and watched a woman's fingers tap rhythm against an armrest. Parts of me do, she said. Which parts? She thought about Elena's grip on her hand at the gala. She thought about Damien's hands in the dark. She thought about the specific satisfaction of being a person who moved when other people didn't, which was not courage in any storybook sense, but just the refusal to accept that stillness was an option when something true needed responding to. The parts that know, there's still work here, she said. Marco nodded. He understood the sentence the way he understood most of her sentences, not just the surface of it. The foundation idea, he said. You mentioned it once, something about helping families with medical debt. She had mentioned it the second week to Elena, in the garden, when Elena had asked her what she would do if money were not a constraint. She had said it half joking, the way you said things you meant when you weren't ready to mean them out loud. It's a long way from an idea to a thing, she said. Everything is, until it isn't. She looked at her brother. 17 years old, AP classes and overdue lab reports, and a resilience that Elena had correctly identified, and that Sophia had been too busy protecting to fully acknowledge. When did you get so pragmatic? She said. Around the time my sister started working for a crime lord in Westchester, he said. It accelerated my development. She laughed. It came out of her without warning, real and unglamorous. The laugh of a woman who had been running on fear and adrenaline for the better part of a week, and had just discovered there was still something underneath it that was capable of being genuinely surprised by something funny. Marco laughed too. They sat on the cold stone steps of an enormous house in the November morning and laughed, and it was not the laugh of people who had won something clean. It was the laugh of people who had survived something complicated and were still in the middle of understanding what surviving it meant. The Reyes Foundation opened its first office 14 months later. Not in Manhattan, in Washington Heights, 6 blocks from the apartment with the broken elevator, and the third-floor light that had been out for 6 weeks until Marco fixed it himself with a borrowed ladder and a $10 bulb. The office was small. The walls needed paint. The front window had a crack in the lower left corner that the building super had promised to address and hadn't. Sophia hired 3 people in the first month. Social workers, both of them, with the particular kind of bone-deep competence that came from years of working in systems that gave them almost nothing and asking them to do almost everything. A part-time accountant who worked evenings and had his own medical debt story, which was how Sophia had found him. Through the intake process, the family who came to them in crisis and stayed to help once the crisis passed. The foundation's focus was medical debt navigation for families in the specific crisis corridor, the space between too much income for maximum assistance and too little income for private coverage to be anything but theoretical. The space Sophia and Marco and Carmen had lived in for 4 years. The space that ate people alive and then left no record of having done so. Carmen attended the opening. She walked in on her own, slowly, with the oxygen concentrator in a shoulder bag that Marco had found online and had presented to her with the gravity of someone presenting a solution he had engineered specifically for this purpose. The pulmonary fibrosis hadn't reversed. It didn't reverse. But the new medication protocol, properly funded and properly administered for 14 months, had stabilized what needed stabilizing. Carmen moved through the small office and looked at the walls and the filing system and the intake forms and the photograph on the front desk. Sophia and Marco and Elena in the garden, taken by one of the groundskeepers on a morning in late October, the roses behind them giving their last color of the season. And she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would have hated the crack in the window." "We're getting it fixed," Sophia said. "He would have already fixed it." "We don't all have his timeline." Carmen looked at her. At this daughter who had become, in the process of surviving a series of events Carmen had been told about incrementally and still didn't fully understand, something she recognized and didn't have a word for. The adult version of the child who had stood in the hallway 12 years ago and chosen to be between the danger and the people who mattered. "I'm proud of you," Carmen said. Sophia accepted it. She had been practicing accepting things, love, help, the acknowledgement of people who saw her accurately. It did not come naturally. It was, she had decided, the hardest therapy she had undertaken. Elena walked into the Hargrove Foundation Charity Gala the following November on her own feet, not without the cane. The cane was a tool, not a concession, and Elena had made her peace with the distinction between the 2 months ago, in the garden, on a morning when she had looked at it and said to Sophia, "It's not a defeat, it's an adaptation, there's a difference." And Sophia had said, "Yes." And Elena had said, "Stop agreeing with everything I say, it's unchallenging." And Sophia had said, "You're being wise, which means you're not giving me much to disagree with." And Elena had laughed, which had still, 14 months in, the quality of something newly returned. The gala was the same ballroom, the same chandelier, bohemian, Sophia had eventually looked it up, out of a stubbornness she couldn't fully account for. The same geography of wealth and influence arranged around tables in the specific configurations of people who needed to be seen near certain other people. The piano in the corner, the man in the tuxedo. Debussy drifting over the ambient noise of an event that raised millions for causes that looked beautiful in press releases. Sophia was not wearing a black uniform. She was wearing a dress that Elena had selected with the decisive authority of a woman who had spent decades understanding what clothes communicated and had opinions about what Sophia should communicate on this particular night. It was dark green. It was better than anything she had owned before. She felt, in it, like a version of herself she was still growing into, which was either discomfort or forward motion, and was probably both. Damien was beside her. Not in front of her, not managing the room in the way she had watched him manage rooms. The tactical positioning of a man who trusted no space until he had mapped it. Beside her. The distinction had taken 8 months to arrive, and it had arrived not through conversation, but through the gradual negotiation of 2 people who had looked at each other clearly and decided that clarity was something to move toward rather than manage. Elena moved through the room with her cane and the specific dignity of a woman who had learned that dignity was not a product of ease, but of decision. People stepped back. Not from fear, from something closer to recognition, the way a room makes space for something that has earned its place in it. She stopped at the spot near the east windows. Table 14. The same geography. She stood there for a moment, looking at the chair where she had been sitting when Margot Ashford had raised her hand, looking at the space where a woman in a black uniform with $63 in her apron pocket had stepped forward into the most consequential moment of her own life without understanding that it was. Then she turned and found Sophia across the room, and she raised her chin in the specific gesture. Small, definitive, a movement that said, "I see you, I see what you did. I see what it cost, and I see what it built." Sophia raised hers back. The chandelier light fell through the room the way it always had, indiscriminate, landing on everyone equally regardless of what they had done or survived or chosen or paid for. The piano moved through Debussy. The waitstaff circulated. The architecture of the evening proceeded with all its familiar momentum. But something in the room was different than it had been a year ago, and the something was not architectural and not atmospheric, and not anything that would show up in a photograph. It was the presence of three people. A woman with a cane who had once been confined to a wheelchair and had chosen not to remain so. A boy who was now a young man standing at the edge of his own future with the confidence of someone who had already survived the hardest audition. And a woman in a dark green dress who had walked into this room 12 months ago with a tray in her hands and $63 in her pocket and had looked at a moment that required someone to move and had decided, without fully understanding what she was deciding, that she was the someone. Damien's hand found hers at her side. Not a gesture for the room, just a hand finding another hand in the dark. The oldest and most ordinary human claim against everything that tried to separate people from what mattered. She didn't look at him. She looked at the room, at Elena moving through it on her own feet, at Marco near the window, talking to someone, his face open and unguarded in the way young faces were when they had not yet decided to close. She looked at the room full of people who had stood still a year ago and thought, "We are not the same anymore, any of us. Not the women in the ballroom, or the boy by the window, or the man whose hand was in hers, or the city that held all of them in its enormous, indifferent grip. Something had moved through them all and left them altered in the specific way that things which cost something always altered the people who paid." The pianist finished Debussy. He turned a page. He began something else, something with more motion in it, and across the ballroom Elena Volkov turned toward the music and closed her eyes and moved her weight, barely perceptibly, from one foot to the other. Dancing, or the beginning of it, or the memory of it becoming slowly, deliberately, the thing itself again. Sophia watched her and said nothing, and held on to the hand in hers, and let the music do what music did when you finally stopped being too afraid to let it reach you.